Have you ever looked at the modern political map of the United States? You know, like when election night rolls around and they pull up the big touch screen?
Oh, yeah, the classic red and blue puzzle.
Right. And when that map fills in, I mean, we all expect to see that massive unbroken block of deep red stretching all the way across the South.
Yeah, it's practically a given at this point.
Exactly. We expect this overwhelming association of white evangelical voters with the Republican Party. And I think there's this tendency, especially if you're just, casually observing politics, to assume it was just always that way.
It's some sort of immutable law of political nature.
Yeah, exactly. Like the South is conservative, evangelicals vote Republican, end of story, right?
Right.
But we are going to totally shatter that assumption today.
Which is good, because honestly, that's the most common trap in historical thinking. Assuming the present is just a slightly shinier version of the past. But when you actually look at the middle of the 20th century, the electoral map looks completely alien compared to today. I mean, the South wasn't a Republican stronghold at all.
No, it was the absolute bedrock of the Democratic Party.
Right. So to understand how that flipped, you have to look at this highly contingent, incredibly messy realignment. And this all happens roughly between, say, 1948 and 1976.
And that right there is exactly our mission for this deep dive, because for the history students listening to this, or the political junkies, or really just anyone trying to make sense of American political evolution, we are tracing this massive 30-year migration.
A migration of both ideology and voters.
Yeah, exactly. We're looking at how white evangelicals and the quote-unquote solid South abandoned their post-Civil War home in the Democratic Party, and how they forged this completely new Republican coalition.
Right. It wasn't a straight line by any means.
No, definitely not. But there is this very specific mystery at the center of all this that we need to solve today. Because if you've ever heard the sort of shorthand version of this era, you've probably heard that one man was the ultimate pivot point.
Ah, yes, the legendary evangelist Billy Graham.
Right. The theory goes that he was the architect who basically single-handedly walked these voters across the aisle. So we have a massive stack of sources on the table to test that theory.
We've got a lot to get through.
We really do. We've got historical dossiers. We have Kevin M. Kruse's book, One Nation Under God, Daniel K. Williams' God's Own Party, the original platforms of the Dixiecrats, and even Billy Graham's own autobiography, Just As I Am.
Which is great, because it means we can look at this from the absolute highest levels of presidential strategy all the way down to the private, agonizing moments of a single voter's conscience.
I love that. But to figure out if Billy Graham was the grand architect of this shift, or maybe just a catalyst like a mirror reflecting a movement that was already underway, we actually can't start with partisan politics.
No, you really can't. You have to start with the Cold War.
Right. We're talking about the 1950s here. So the dust of World War II has barely settled, but the existential dread of the nuclear age is really just kicking into high gear.
Yeah, and 1949 is the key year there. That's when the Soviet Union successfully tests its first atomic bomb.
The monopoly is officially broken.
Exactly. And into this atmosphere of total apocalyptic anxiety, you get one of the largest revivals of public religiosity in American history, sweeping the nation.
And the timing of that is definitely not a coincidence, right?
Not at all. I mean, the threat of nuclear annihilation creates this intense psychological need for moral clarity. People are terrified. And the most visible figure of this search for clarity becomes Billy Graham.
Yeah, and he kind of bursts onto the scene right as this is peaking.
Right. So in the fall of 1949, literally right as news of the Soviet bomb is dominating the headlines, Graham holds this massive tent crusade in Los Angeles.
You're supposed to be, what, 3 weeks?
Yeah, just 3 weeks. But it goes for 8. It just explodes, and he becomes a national phenomenon overnight.
Because he frames the entire geopolitical struggle, not just in military or economic terms, but as this cosmic battle. It's God-fearing America versus godless communism.
He's effectively merging national defense with personal salvation.
Yeah.
Which was incredibly potent.
So potent. But I want to fast forward just a bit to his 1957 New York crusade, because this is where the sheer scale of his influence becomes just undeniable.
Oh, the Madison Square Garden event?
Yes. I mean, this wasn't just some weekend tent revival. He literally took over Madison Square Garden for 16 straight weeks.
That's from May through September of 1957.
Right. The logistics of that alone are staggering to think about.
It's wild. He drew roughly 2.3 million in-person attendees over those 4 months. And, because of the advent of mass broadcasting, The ABC network started televising the Saturday evening services live across the whole country.
So he's reaching tens of millions of people right in their living rooms.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was providing this unifying national vocabulary of faith at a moment when the country felt incredibly vulnerable.
But, okay, this is where the history takes a really sharp turn. And this is where Princeton historian Kevin M. Cruz's work in One Nation Under God comes into play.
Right, because Cruz's argument really challenges the conventional wisdom here.
Totally. Because Cruz argues that this entire concept of America as fundamentally a Christian nation, at least in the modern state-sanctioned way we use that phrase today, wasn't just inherited from the Founding Fathers.
No, it was a deliberate mid-20th century branding campaign.
A branding campaign, which is just, that blew my mind.
It forces you to look at the literal monuments of our civic religion.
Yeah.
Think about the phrases that feel like they've been etched in stone since 1776, right? Like, under God in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yeah, I always just assumed that was always there. That wasn't added until 1954.
Exactly. Congress passed a joint resolution to insert those two specific words to differentiate American philosophy from Soviet atheism.
Wow. And then there's the official national motto, "In God We Trust," which replaced "E Pluribus Unum."
Right, and that wasn't officially adopted by Congress until 1956. So what you're seeing is this rapid, highly organized codification of a completely new civic faith.
And the ultimate figurehead of this movement was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, which to me is endlessly fascinating.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. This is the Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, a man who was not previously known for, wearing his religion on his sleeve.
Very true. He was a military man through and through.
Right. But then, 10 days after his inauguration in 1953, he gets baptized into the National Presbyterian Church.
It's actually the only time in history a president has been baptized while in office.
Which is crazy. And then he institutes the first national prayer breakfast. He starts opening cabinet meetings with silent prayer.
Because he fundamentally believed that to fight the ideological Cold War, the nation needed a shared moral foundation.
Right. He famously said something like, "Our form of government makes no sense unless it's founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is."
Yes, the specific denomination literally didn't matter to him. It was the public posture of piety that counted. But Cruz introduces this deeply controversial mechanic behind how this civic religion was actually built.
Okay, yes, let's unpack this mechanics part, because going from a Billy Graham tent revival to a corporate boardroom sounds like a massive, massive leap.
It does.
So how exactly does Cruz argue that corporate America basically invented Christian America?
Well, you have to look at the domestic trauma that corporate leaders experienced back during the 1930s. The Great Depression led to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, right?
Right, which vastly expanded the size, the scope, and the regulatory power of the federal government.
Exactly. And for mid-century business elites, we're talking about organizations like the National Association of Manufacturers. This was terrifying. They viewed the New Deal as creeping socialism.
But when they tried to argue against it on purely economic grounds, like, arguing for lower taxes or deregulation, they just lost.
They lost badly. The working class, who felt like they had been saved by these New Deal programs, just wasn't buying the corporate argument.
So the economic argument fails, and the boardroom realizes they need a completely new way to convince the public that a massive federal government is dangerous.
And they realize that the most potent anti-statist language in America isn't economic at all. It's religious.
Oh, wow. So they pivot.
Big time. In the 1940s and 50s, corporate leaders began heavily funding conservative ministers and organizations, like James Fifield's spiritual mobilization.
And the goal there was to essentially link free enterprise directly with religious freedom.
Yes. They helped promote a theology that framed the individual, unregulated pursuit of wealth as a God-given right. And they framed the expanding federal government as this idolatrous, encroaching threat to personal salvation.
They essentially baptized capitalism.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, but I have to push back here for a second. Because if I'm listening to this, a huge red flag just went up in my head.
Zero.
Are we really supposed to believe that this massive nationwide religious revival, millions of people crying in Madison Square Garden, millions watching on television the genuine terror of the Cold War, was all just an AstroTurf campaign funded by corporate executives who wanted to bust labor unions?
It sounds a bit much when you frame it like that, yeah.
It feels incredibly cynical,
Yeah.
like almost like a conspiracy theory that strips all the agency away from the actual believers.
And that is exactly why it is essential to maintain a clear distinction here. Daniel K. Williams's work in God's Own Party provides a really necessary corrective to the most cynical readings of Cruz.
Okay, good, because I was worried for a second.
No, you absolutely cannot reduce the mid-century religious revival to a corporate public relations stunt. For millions of average Americans, the fear of Soviet communism was deeply sincere.
Their faith was a genuine psychological survival mechanism.
Exactly. When they prayed for the nation, they weren't secretly hoping for corporate tax cuts. They were terrified of a nuclear holocaust.
Right. I mean, if the Soviet Union has the bomb and their stated ideology is state atheism, then your belief in God isn't just some Sunday ritual. It feels like the ultimate bulwark against global destruction.
The historical reality is that both things happened simultaneously. The corporate interests absolutely provided the funding, the infrastructure, and that specific anti-government framing.
But the movement only exploded because it tapped into a very real, very raw existential dread among the populace.
Precisely. The faith itself wasn't fake.
Oh.
But, and this is the crucial point for our deep dive, the political alignment of that faith was being actively shaped.
Right. The Cold War created this vast, unified cultural identity centered on conservative Protestantism. But that religious identity didn't just immediately translate into voting for the Republican Party.
No, it took a long time. And to understand how that actually happened, we have to look at the massive domestic fracture happening at the exact same time.
Which means we are leaving the unifying thread of Cold War faith for a minute, and we are pulling on the incredibly destructive thread of race.
Yeah, this is where the story gets really complicated.
Because while the country is trying to project this unified, one nation under God image to the Soviets, the reality on the ground is that America is tearing itself apart over segregation.
And this fracture is what finally cracks the Solid South.
So for you listening, if you are studying political history, the concept of the Solid South is absolutely foundational.
It really is. Following the Civil War and the end of Reconstruction, the Republican Party was hated in the South.
I mean, it was the party of Lincoln, the party of the invading Union Army.
Exactly. So for nearly a century, to be a white Southerner basically meant you were a Democrat by default. The region functioned as a one-party state.
It was an ironclad alliance. But then the National Democratic Party began to change, and the definitive rupture happens at the 1948 Democratic National Convention.
This is such a moment of pure political theater and massive historical consequence.
Set the scene for us.
So President Harry Truman is facing a really tough re-election. He is a Democrat, but he has recently taken steps that completely enrage the southern wing of his party.
Most notably, he issues Executive Order 9981, right? Which mandates the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces.
Yes. And when the Democrats gather in Philadelphia for their convention in '48, Northern liberals, led by a young mayor from Minneapolis named Hubert Humphrey, push the party to adopt a strong civil rights plank in the official platform.
And Humphrey gives this blistering speech. He says it is time for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk into the bright sunshine of human rights.
Which is a beautiful line, but the reaction from the Southern delegates is immediate and explosive.
They literally walk out, don't they?
They do. The entire Mississippi delegation and half of the Alabama delegation physically stand up and walk right out of the convention hall.
Which is wild. They are abandoning the party that has protected their regional interests for a century, all because they view federal civil rights as an existential threat to the Southern social order.
And they don't just go home and sulk. They head down to Birmingham, Alabama, and form their own rogue political party.
The states' rights Democratic Party, more famously known as the Dixiecrats.
Right. And they nominate Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina, to run for president against Truman.
And Thurmond's campaign is entirely built on defending segregation.
Completely. And the real shockwave of 1948 is that Thurmond actually wins 4 Deep South states.
Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, all giving their electoral votes to a third-party candidate solely over the issue of civil rights.
Now, Thurmond obviously doesn't win the presidency, and most of those Dixiecrats quietly return to the Democratic fold the following year.
But the psychological barrier had been broken.
Exactly. They proved that if the National Democratic Party pushed civil rights, the South would defect.
And the National Party does keep pushing. Over the next 2 decades, the pressure just builds and builds, until we get to 1964, which is a massive watershed moment.
Right. President Lyndon B. Johnson, a Texas Democrat, signs the Civil Rights Act into law, officially dismantling legal segregation in public accommodations.
And you just have to look at the immediate electoral consequence that fall.
It's staggering.
The Republican nominee, Barry Goldwater, votes against the Civil Rights Act, arguing it is an unconstitutional federal overreach. And Goldwater gets absolutely crushed nationally.
He loses in a landslide.
But he carries 5 Deep South states.
And meanwhile, Strom Thurmond takes the Senate floor, announces he is leaving the Democratic Party forever, and formally registers as a Republican.
It's all starting to shift. And then, in 1968, the fracture deepens even further with another third-party run.
George Wallace.
Right. The fiercely segregationist governor of Alabama runs for president and captures 5 southern states. He peels away the most intensely aggrieved, working-class white voters who feel completely alienated by the federal government.
But, this is where we have to pause.
Yeah.
We have to introduce the concept of multi-causality here.
Yeah, because Daniel K. Williams makes a brilliant point in his analysis of this era.
He really does. It is very tempting to look at the defection of the South and say it was 100% about race and segregation.
And race was the dynamite, absolutely. But it wasn't the only explosive in the room.
Right, because if it was just about race, why did the realignment continue long after the civil rights movement achieved its major legislative victories?
There have to be other massive structural changes happening in the background.
And there are. We have to talk about the Sun Belt.
What's Sun Belt?
Yeah. During the Cold War, the federal government poured billions of dollars into defense contracts, aerospace engineering, and military bases all across the South and the Southwest.
And you also have the advent of widespread residential air conditioning, which sounds like a small detail.
But it changed everything.
It literally changed the demographic map of the United States. It made the Deep South habitable for massive, year-round corporate relocation.
Exactly. You have this massive influx of northern executives and engineers moving to places like Atlanta, Dallas, and Houston. They are building these sprawling new suburbs.
So the economy of the South is shifting away from rural, agrarian sharecropping and textile mills. It's moving toward this white-collar corporate economy.
And these new Sunbelt suburbanites have entirely different political priorities. They are deeply concerned with high taxes, federal regulations, and the power of labor unions.
So you have a region that is simultaneously furious about forced integration and also experiencing this huge economic boom that makes them heavily receptive to traditional Republican economic arguments.
It's a very volatile mix, and that complexity explains a phenomenon that often confuses people studying this era, which is the massive lag between national and local voting patterns.
Yes. The tectonic plates analogy, I think about this all the time.
That's the best way to describe it.
Right, because when a political realignment happens, it's not like flipping a light switch, it's like a tectonic plate shifting. You feel the massive earthquake at the surface right away. That's the presidency.
But deep underground, at the local level, the rock takes decades to actually settle into its new position.
Exactly. So in the 1960s and 70s, a white voter in Georgia might cast a ballot for Barry Goldwater or Richard Nixon for president because they loathe the National Democratic Party's stance on civil rights or the counterculture.
But when they flip the ballot over to vote for the local sheriff, the mayor, or a state representative, they still vote Democrat.
Which seems crazy. Like, if you hate the National Party, why keep voting for the local one?
Because the local Democratic machine still controlled everything. They controlled the patronage, the road contracts, the school boards.
And local Southern Democrats didn't look or sound anything like the Northern liberals in Washington.
Not at all. A local Democratic sheriff in Alabama in 1968 was likely a staunch segregationist himself. It took an entire generation for the Republican Party to actually build local infrastructure, recruit candidates, and convince Southerners that it was socially acceptable to call themselves Republicans at the neighborhood level.
Wow. Okay, so we have this incredibly volatile landscape in the late 1960s. You have a Southern voting bloc that is completely adrift. They are angry, they're economically transforming, and they are shedding their generational loyalty to the Democrats.
And simultaneously, you have this massive, energized, evangelical culture that has been mobilized by the Cold War.
Right. So if you are the Republican Party, you are looking at these two groups and realizing that if you can capture them, you can build an unbeatable electoral majority for the next half century.
But the big question is, how do you capture them? They don't naturally trust you.
You need a highly sophisticated, highly calibrated strategy. and you need the right messenger.
Enter Richard Nixon and a political operative named Harry Dent.
Harry Dent is such a crucial behind-the-scenes figure in this story, because before working for Nixon, Dent was the top aide to Strom Thurmond.
Which means Dent understood the exact psychological profile of the aggrieved Southern voter better than practically anyone in Washington.
He knew exactly what made them angry, what made them anxious, and most importantly, what language would move them.
Right. Dent becomes a primary architect of what goes down in history as the Southern Strategy.
And the execution of this strategy in the 1968 and 1972 elections relied on highly specific, targeted messaging. Nixon didn't go into the South and explicitly talk about race.
No, that would have backfired nationally. Instead, he ran heavily on two key themes: law and order and states' rights.
Now, we have to examine this impartially based on the historical dossiers we have, because the intent behind the Southern Strategy remains one of the most fiercely debated topics in modern political science.
There are definitely two distinct ways historians interpret this language.
Let's start with the critical perspective, which basically argues that this was purely a cynical racial maneuver.
The critical view asserts that law and order and states' rights were brilliantly disguised racial dog whistles. The argument is that after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a national politician could no longer stand on a stage and yell segregation forever like George Wallace did.
It was just socially unacceptable.
Right, so the Nixon campaign sanitized the language.
So the translation being, when Nixon says states' rights, the white Southern voter hears, I will stop the federal government from forcing your local schools to integrate.
Exactly. And when Nixon says law and order, it's not just about stopping burglaries. It's a coded promise to crack down on the civil rights protests and the urban riots that were terrifying white suburbanites.
That is a really strong argument, that the strategy was a deliberate exploitation of racial animus, just dressed up in respectable constitutional and legal terminology.
But you have a robust counter-perspective from defenders of the strategy who argue that this view is totally reductive and ignores the very real non-racial crises of the late 1960s.
And what is the strongest version of that defense?
The defense points out that the late 1960s were objectively chaotic. You had skyrocketing violent crime rates across the country.
That's true. Crime was a massive issue.
You also had massive, sometimes violent protests against the Vietnam War, tearing university campuses apart. You had a rapidly growing Sunbelt middle class that was genuinely frustrated by high taxes and inflation.
So defenders argue that Nixon was just a pragmatic politician, appealing to a silent majority of suburbanites who sincerely wanted a return to stability and traditional governance.
Right. And to dismiss their very real anxieties about crime and the counterculture as nothing more than disguised racism, they argue, is to misread the historical reality of the era.
Okay, so we have two totally opposing interpretations here. One says it was a cynical racial ploy. The other says it was a standard political appeal to middle-class anxiety. When you synthesize all the sources we're looking at, where does the truth actually land?
The most defensible historical reading is that the Southern Strategy was so phenomenally successful precisely because it was braided. The two threads just cannot be cleanly separated.
So it's both.
Yes. Did Nixon appeal to genuine concerns about crime and economic stability? Yes. Did his campaign fully understand that phrases like law and order would simultaneously signal solidarity with voters motivated by racial backlash? Also yes.
So the genius of the strategy was its ambiguity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It allowed a middle-class voter in the Atlanta suburbs to vote for Nixon, feeling like they were voting for economic stability, while allowing a former Dixiecrat to vote for Nixon, feeling like they were voting against federal integration. It caught both fish with the same net.
Okay, so the political strategy is brilliant and ruthless. Nixon figures out the exact cocktail of economic anxiety, cultural fear, and racial resentment required to pry the South away from the Democrats.
He threads the needle perfectly.
But that still leaves a massive missing piece to our puzzle, because we are talking about a deeply religious voting bloc. The people attending Billy Graham's crusades don't just want a savvy politician, they want moral validation.
Right. A politician talking about states' rights doesn't automatically equate to spiritual righteousness.
And politicians are inherently viewed with suspicion anyway. Nixon could give 100 speeches on traditional values, but voters know politicians lie.
So to elevate a political realignment into a moral imperative, the politician cannot speak for himself. He needs a validator.
He needs the ultimate spiritual authority to stand next to him and signal to the flock that this is the righteous path.
He needs America's pastor. He needs Billy Graham.
And there it is. We are back to Billy Graham.
Graham's role in this realignment is the hinge upon which the entire transition swings.
Mm.
By the late 1960s, Graham is no longer just a popular evangelist. He is an American institution.
And he forms a deeply intimate personal friendship with Richard Nixon, doesn't he?
Very intimate. They golf together, they vacation together, they spend hours and hours on the phone.
And Nixon, who was perhaps the most calculating politician of the 20th century, absolutely understood the political goldmine he had in Graham's friendship.
Oh, he knew exactly what he was doing. Just look at the specific actions detailed in the archives. Starting in 1969, Nixon and Graham institute regular Sunday worship services right inside the White House.
Think about the sheer visual power of that. Every Sunday, the press is taking photos of the President of the United States and the most trusted evangelical leader in the world praying together in the East Room.
It effectively wraps the Nixon administration in a cloak of divine approval. For a conservative evangelical voter, seeing Graham at the White House signaled that Nixon wasn't just a political choice. He was God's man in Washington.
I think of this as the moral passport stamp.
I like that. What do you mean?
Well, if you are a white Southern Protestant in 1972, your father was a Democrat, your grandfather was a Democrat, voting for a Republican feels like a profound betrayal of your regional and familial identity. It feels viscerally wrong.
It's a huge psychological hurdle.
But then you look at the television, and there's Billy Graham, the man you trust to guide your immortal soul, smiling, praying, and laughing with Richard Nixon.
And Graham doesn't even have to explicitly endorse him.
Exactly. His presence alone acts as a passport stamp. It says it is spiritually acceptable to cross this political border.
And that is the precise answer to our core mystery today. Was Billy Graham the sole architect of the realignment? No.
The racial fracture of the Democrats, the economic boom of the Sun Belt, the cultural chaos of the 1960s, all of that was happening with or without him?
But Graham was the indispensable moral catalyst. He provided the permission structure. He sanctified a migration that was already fundamentally underway, reflecting the voters' own anxieties back to them in the comforting light of religious authority.
And it culminates in the 1972 election. Nixon wins a staggering 49-state landslide.
He completely sweeps the South.
The realignment looks totally permanent at that point. The Republican Party has successfully captured the Sun Belt, the South, and the Evangelicals, but the cost of providing that moral passport stamp proved to be devastating for Billy Graham personally.
It leads to one of the most tragic codas in American religious history, the Watergate scandal.
Right. In 1973 and 1974, the Nixon presidency completely unravels, and the mechanism of its destruction is the release of the secret White House tape recordings.
Which is just, it changes everything.
Because this wasn't just political espionage. The tapes revealed the raw, unfiltered character of the man sitting in the Oval Office.
The paranoia, the vindictiveness, the slurs, the constant aggressive profanity.
And Billy Graham, who had staked his pristine moral reputation on Nixon's character, had to sit down and read those transcripts.
In his autobiography, Just As I Am, Graham's reflection on this moment is just heartbreaking.
What does he say?
He writes about how he literally recoiled physically as he read the transcripts. He wept. He couldn't reconcile the pious, thoughtful friend he thought he knew with the deceitful, profane man on the tapes.
He called the revelation nearly unbearable, didn't he?
He did. It's the ultimate betrayal. Graham realizes that he had been used. He had provided the moral sheen for an administration that was deeply corrupt behind closed doors.
Wow.
And Graham expresses profound regret over his political entanglement. He realized that by tying his spiritual authority so closely to the machinery of partisan politics, he had compromised his own ministry.
He learned, the hard way, the danger of fusing the cross with the flag.
Following Watergate, Graham noticeably pulled back from that kind of overt, intimate presidential access.
So, if you are analyzing this historically, you look at 1974. Nixon resigns in disgrace. The architect of the political strategy is ruined. Billy Graham, the moral validator, has stepped back in horror.
You would logically assume that this newly forged Republican coalition would shatter into a million pieces. The glue holding it together just dissolved.
Right. But this is where history throws us a massive curveball. Because the assumption that the South and evangelicals were permanently locked into the Republican Party after 1972 is completely upended just 4 years later.
We get to the 1976 presidential election.
Yes. Newsweek magazine famously declares 1976 the year of the evangelical. The cultural power of conservative Christianity is at its absolute peak.
But the man who rides that religious wave all the way to the White House is not Republican.
It's Jimmy Carter, a former governor of Georgia, a peanut farmer, and crucially a Democrat.
But he is also an openly, enthusiastically born-again Southern Baptist.
Which is fascinating because Carter speaks the language of the evangelical voter with a fluency that Nixon never possessed.
Oh, absolutely. He teaches Sunday school. He actually uses the phrase born again on the campaign trail, which was a deeply intimate, recognizable signal to conservative Christians at the time.
And you really have to understand Carter's appeal in the direct aftermath of Watergate. The electorate is just traumatized by political corruption and cynicism.
They want someone pure.
Right. Carter runs a campaign essentially offering moral cleansing. He famously promises the public, "I will never lie to you."
For voters reeling from Nixon's deceit, Carter's sincere, unvarnished faith authenticated that promise. He wasn't offering a slick political strategy. He was offering personal integrity.
And the electoral map in 1976 is just stunning when you look at it. Carter wins the presidency, and he does it by sweeping almost the entire South.
He wins back states like Texas, Florida, and North Carolina that had just defected to Nixon. He captures massive margins of the white evangelical vote.
Which proves a vital historical point from Daniel K. Williams, doesn't it?
Yes, that the capture of the Christian right by the Republican Party was not foreordained. The 1976 election reveals just how fluid this realignment still was.
The tectonic plates hadn't locked in place yet.
Not at all. For one brief, shining moment, Jimmy Carter manages to completely reassemble the old Franklin Roosevelt coalition.
He gets the white South, the evangelical voters, the Northern labor unions, and African-American voters, all pulling the lever for the Democratic Party.
It highlights that the primary allegiance of these voters at this exact moment was highly contingent. They were not voting out of strict, unyielding partisan loyalty to the GOP.
They were voting based on the perceived moral character and the cultural identity of the candidate.
Exactly. The question of which party was truly the vehicle for their values was genuinely still open.
It really is the ultimate road not taken in American politics. It proves that realignments are messy, they're reversible, and they are deeply dependent on the specific individuals and crises of the moment.
Now, obviously, we know how the story goes from there. Carter's presidency is beset by economic crises, the Iran hostage situation, and cultural shifts that eventually alienate those same evangelical voters.
Right, which fractures that fragile reunion and paves the way for Ronald Reagan in 1980. But 1976 remains the absolute proof that the map wasn't always destined to look the way it does today.
It serves as a necessary reminder that political coalitions are not monolithic blocks of stone. They are fragile alliances held together by temporary shared interests.
So, as we pull all of these threads together, what have we actually discovered about this massive 30-year realignment? We set out to test the shorthand that Billy Graham just flipped a switch and turned the South red.
And we found that history is vastly more complicated. This was a multi-generational evolution.
It required the existential terror of the Cold War to forge a new civic religion, which was explicitly designed by corporate interests and then embraced by an anxious public, fusing patriotism with piety.
It required the Democratic Party to take a moral stand on civil rights, fundamentally fracturing its century-old alliance with the white South and sending millions of voters into political exile.
It required the economic transformation of the Sun Belt, creating a new middle class receptive to conservative economic arguments.
And it required the calculated genius of Richard Nixon's Southern Strategy, utilizing braided language like law and order to appeal to both genuine governing anxieties and deep-seated racial resentments.
And right at the center of that storm was Billy Graham. Not the sole architect, but the essential moral catalyst.
The man who provided the permission structure for millions of voters to cross the aisle with their consciences intact, only to find himself heartbroken by the reality of the political machine he had helped legitimize.
The lesson for anyone trying to understand today's political map is that coalitions are built piece by painstaking piece. The red states are red and the blue states are blue today because of millions of individual, agonizing choices made over decades, driven by a complex braid of faith, fear, economics, and race.
That is exactly right.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over on your own. We've spent this time dissecting how Billy Graham provided this permission structure for voters to align their faith with Richard Nixon, and how that exact structure led to his profound disillusionment when the Watergate tapes were released.
It's a tragic arc.
It really is. And it raises a timeless, haunting question for any voter in any era, regardless of their political affiliation. When a religious movement decides to tie its ultimate moral authority to the raw, pragmatic machinery of partisan politics, who is actually converting whom?
Wow.
In the quest for influence and power, does the church successfully shape the state, or does the state ultimately consume the church?
That is the enduring warning echoing out of this history.
Something to think about until our next deep dive.